Good morning again. We're continuing our study in James. We're going to go to chapter 2 today. Just as a reminder of what we mentioned last week, James is a type of literature that we call wisdom literature. It's one of the three types in the Old Testament. Psalms, Proverbs, they're part of the wisdom literature, and James certainly writes in that same idea. Wisdom literature is literature that has an importance of belief, but more than belief, it's behavior. They expect that you would, in wisdom, learn how to live wisely. And so James is dealing with that, and oftentimes the word wise or wisdom comes up in this short letter of James. Today we're looking at chapter 2. Now, in your International Study Guide, it doesn't begin until the 14th verse, but I want to mention those first 13 verses as well, because they'll come up again. In those, James is talking about when we show partiality, when we show favoritism. Almost like in politics, we look at a person and we say, well, this is an important person, and we may look at a different person and say, they're not an important person. So we treat the one with more regard than we treat the other. And James is going to talk about that because that comes up in the latter part of this chapter where we talk about faith and works. And again, it has to do with those very items of faith and how do we treat people, how do we act around people based on what they have or who they are. All right, as we get into this experience here in James, the second part of the chapter, we want to begin by saying that God has a great concern for the poor of the earth. Abraham Lincoln said that God must love the common people because he made so many of them. Well, in the scriptures, time and time again, it comes up that God sees and is caring and involved with the common people, particularly the poor people. If you remember in Leviticus 19, there's a command that you should not harvest all your fields. You leave the corners for the poor. Particularly, they list three of those. One would be the widows, the other would be the orphans, and the third would be the alien or the stranger that dwells in your land. You would leave part of the field for them to harvest so that they would not starve. We find that in other places in the scripture, even in the Psalms. The psalmist speaks of God's compassion for the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. And he also reminds people that you were suffering, you were poor when you were in Egypt, and you felt disenfranchised, and God came to you. Matter of fact, in Exodus chapter 3, as God speaks to Moses, and he tells him he wants him to go down into Egypt. Now, he's fled from Egypt because he killed a man there, and he killed an Egyptian that was oppressing a Hebrew. But because of the fear of retaliation, he had fled, and he had gone to Midian, and there was taking care of a man's sheep. The man's name was Jethro, and he married one of his daughters, and so spent 40 years there. Then God speaks to him in a burning bush and says, I want you to go back to Egypt, lead my people out. And he introduces a thought with these words: I have seen the oppression of the people. I have heard their cries, and I am come down to deliver them. You get those three things. God sees, he hears, and he acts. And so he sends Moses to go and tell Pharaoh to let the people go. That's a cornerstone of the Hebrew belief. Not just in terms of God, but in terms of themselves. So God is not a God who just kind of created the universe and then set it in motion and said, I'm stepping back and let fall what falls. People can do that too. We can say, I'm just not going to get involved. And God told his people, but I want you involved. I want you to care for my creation. And in Leviticus 19, it says there, as Jesus quoted, that is the second greatest commandment, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And so forth in other places in Leviticus, but particularly Leviticus 19, he talks about the just scale. He talks about treating people rightly, that you don't take a person's cloak we'd say coat, as a pledge and keep it overnight. You give it back to them, even if they haven't paid back the bill by sundown. You give back to them because that may be the only bed that they have or the only blanket by which they can wrap themselves. So there's great, great compassion for the poor. We'll come up with that in a few moments in chapter 2, verse 14, where James talks about that. Now, he cites a couple of examples of people who lived by faith, but also acted in their deeds. But first of all, he's going to talk about Abraham. Abraham is spoken of as the father of the Jewish people. He's the great man. The Hebrew people speak of themselves as the sons of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Those are the three great patriarchs, father, son, and grandson. But Abraham is the top on the list. And God calls Abraham and says, I want you to sacrifice your son. What? I want you to sacrifice your son. See, Isaac had one son. Abraham had one son, and his name was Isaac. And he was supposed to be the one that would populate the earth with the descendants of Abraham. He's the only son. And God says, I want him sacrificed. Now, we would say, that sounds strange. But Abraham lived in a time when that was not strange. It was oftentimes that a person would sacrifice their children, and particularly their firstborn, to a god to win favors. That might be fertility favors in terms of their cattle or their crops. It might be in terms of children to be produced. There was many reasons that you might sacrifice. Now, we would say, gosh, that seems strange, but not so. In Hawaii, at the time that it became part of the United States, it was not unheard of for the people there to sacrifice a young maiden or a young soldier in a volcano to the god of fire. In our own country here, the Native Americans would oftentimes, that lived near Niagara Falls, sacrifice a young person by placing them in a canoe, and they went over the falls, a gift to the gods. In the Hebrew times, the people of Canaan particularly sacrificed their children to a god they called Moloch. And they had a fiery furnace in which they would throw their baby into the mouth of Moloch, and it would be devoured by the fire. This was a way to win favor. So Abraham's not doing something that seems strange, except that he maybe had thought his God wouldn't do that, but he nonetheless follows. And he's ready to sacrifice Isaac, and God stops him. And he says to him, because you were willing to sacrifice your only son, Isaac, I will bless you. Now, God knew whether Abraham would sacrifice his son Isaac or not. Abraham might not have known. I'm not sure I would have known what I would do. I read an article this past week about a young 6-year-old boy who stepped between his sister, younger sister, and an attacking dog. And the dog attacked him. He had to have over 90 stitches and under surgery to begin the healing process in his body. And this 6-year-old boy said, if somebody had to die, I thought it should be me and not my sister. I don't know whether I would have ever thought that at 6 years of age. I'm not sure I would think that at 60 years of age. And I'm beyond that. You don't know what you're going to do until you're in the place to do it. Anyway, Abraham believed God. Now, Abraham is batting 1,000. He's in the roll call of faith that we read about in Hebrews 11. He's one of the people that God sets up there and says, this is my man. I'm pleased with him. All right? Well, except Abraham didn't bat 1,000. See, there was that incident when he went down to Egypt and took his wife Sarah. And Sarah was a good-looking woman. And he thought, oh boy, he's going to get down there and I'm going to be among strangers and they're going to want my wife. The only way they can get her is if they kill me. And then she's free. So, Sarah, tell him you're my sister. Save my skin. Well, bad enough that it happened once, happened twice. He did this. And yeah, but the ledgers, he did a lot of good. So, 2 mistakes, that's not too bad. That'll still get you by. Well, Maybe. Now, the second person we have is Rahab. And Rahab is listed by James as a prostitute. She was a resident in the city of Jericho when the people of Israel were coming out of the 40 years in the wilderness and getting ready to go into the land of Canaan to conquer it. And they sent 2 spies to Jericho. Now these 2 spies got inside the city because the gates were open during the day, and word got around. Now how did word get around? Well, to begin with, Rahab's house was not just a house of prostitution. It was more like a tavern. It was a place where you could get rooms to stay overnight for other reasons than her trade. It was also a place where you'd find out the latest news. And so these spies had gone there and they were hearing what was being said by the people, and they were going to report it back. Well, Rahab realized that they were Hebrew people, and so she took them up on the roof and hid them. And when the word got back to the ruler, the mayor of Jericho, he said, Rahab, you need to turn these people loose. And she said, well, I think they went out the door before you closed the gates. She had hid them on the top of the roof. And so then the gates were closed, and she gives them the word of what to do, but she says, look, this town is scared to death of you folks. They've heard what you did to the Amorites, and they're scared. Please remember my family when you come in to conquer this city. And they give her the scarlet cord and tell her to hang this in the window. She lets them down over the wall because her house was against the wall, and tells them to go into the mountains and hide there for 3 days, and then to go back over. Well, that's one good deed against a whole bunch of not so good deeds. But she's in the roll call of faith in Hebrews chapter 11, along with Abraham and some other people. She's listed and with the title prostitute. How come? She didn't have enough good deeds to outweigh Abraham. And Abraham had a lot of good deeds, but he messed up one. And James said, if you keep the whole law, it says that in the beginning of chapter 2, if you keep the whole law but fail in one, you're guilty of all. Well, that doesn't seem fair, but that's the way it's written in the scripture. So none of us are going to make it on the idea that we did the right thing. And that's kind of in Ephesians, the second chapter, where Paul writes and he says, by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God. It is not of your works, lest anyone should boast. For we are his workmanship, created for good works, that we should walk in them. You see that difference? For by grace you have been saved. It is grace that saves us. It is grace that gives us our standing with God. But we have that standing so that we can work the good works that God prepared. Not just accidentally come along, but God dreamed of us doing good works way before the beginning. Now, let's go back again to the theology that's a part of this, that's important. In Deuteronomy, there's a verse. Again, this is the second giving of the law, but there's a verse in Deuteronomy that's very interesting, because James is going to talk about if you see someone who doesn't have enough clothes, and you say to them, be warmed, don't do anything about it, what good is that? Or if you see somebody who's hungry, and you say, be filled, but you don't do anything about it, what good is that? Now let's put that in the context of God as he speaks his word to the people. In Deuteronomy, the 10th chapter, the 18th verse. Well, let's go back to the 17th verse. For the Lord your God is God, God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who is not partial and takes no bribe, who executes justice for the orphans and the widow, and who loves the strangers, providing them food and clothing. Isn't that interesting? God provides for the widow, the orphan, and the stranger food and clothing. James is saying, if you're going to be a follower of this God of the Old Testament here, we're called to provide food and clothing for the widow and the orphan and the stranger. It's that compassion for the poor and the hurting that's a part of that. And you find it in other places in the scripture as well. there's a little boy who was walking along the beach, and he's picking up starfish. Starfish kind of get washed in with the tide, and then the tide goes out, and the starfish are stranded on the beach. This boy is picking up starfish and throwing them back in the ocean. A man comes along and watches him for a little bit, and he says, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm saving these starfish." And there's perhaps hundreds of them on the beach. And the man says, "What good is that? Look at all these starfish. It isn't going to make any difference." The boy picks up and throws the starfish in, and he says, "Did for that one." You see, we can't save the world ourselves, but we can make a difference. And that difference can be important. If you saw the movie Oh God, with George Burns in it, at the end of it, George is in the courtroom, and he does a couple of card tricks because people are laughing, saying, "You're not God," and he does these tricks. And then he makes this statement, which I think is tremendously important. He says, "I know it's hard to believe in times like these, but maybe if you believe, times like these will change." That's part of it. We can't save the world, but God can use our efforts. Mother Teresa, people said to her, "You're a saint, you're a saint." Mother Teresa said, "No, I'm a small pencil in the hand of a great God." We can be small pencils. Love God, do no harm, do good. Thank you. Bye-bye.